The wind was inside the airplane. At more than 20,000 feet, freezing air rushed through the front of a damaged American bomber, while papers, insulation, and loose metal spun backward through the fuselage. Men who should have been protected by aluminum skin and armored glass were suddenly exposed to open sky. It was the winter of 1943. Over occupied Europe, formations of American B-17 flying fortresses were deep into daylight bombing operations. Their mission was simple on paper and dangerous in reality. Fly straight, hold formation, reach the target, release bombs, and return across hostile territory. But one bomber would face a problem no training manual had prepared for. Inside the aircraft, the crew had already been under pressure for hours. Heavy bombers depended on discipline. Every man had a station. Pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit. Navigator and bombardier in the nose compartment. Engineers and gunners spread through the fuselage. Interphone lines carried orders. Engines had to be monitored constantly. Fuel balance mattered. Formation spacing mattered. Timing mattered even more. Then enemy fighters attacked. German interceptors knew the strengths and weaknesses of the B-17. The bomber carried multiple defensive guns and could absorb surprising punishment, but the front area remained vulnerable during head-on passes. Closing speed was enormous. Seconds decided everything. The crew saw flashes ahead. Machine gun and cannon fire crossed the formation. Metal struck metal. Plexiglass shattered. Instruments jumped. Then came a violent tearing sound unlike ordinary battle damage. The nose of the aircraft was gone. The front section, where the bombardier and navigator worked, had been ripped away. The clean lines of the bomber were replaced by jagged framing and open air. Wind blasted straight into the cockpit area. Loose wiring snapped and whipped in the slipstream. For a moment, no one knew if the aircraft could remain together. The B-17 was large, but it was not designed to lose its forward structure in combat and continue as normal. The nose helped protect crew, housed equipment, and contributed to aerodynamic balance. Remove it, and drag increased sharply. Airflow changed. Debris could strike the propellers or cockpit. More importantly, control systems routed through the fuselage could be damaged. That fear became immediate reality. The pilot gripped the controls and felt little response. On aircraft like the B-17, pilot inputs moved surfaces through mechanical linkages and cables running the length of the plane. If those cables jammed, snapped, or partially separated, the control wheel in the cockpit might move while the elevators or rudder responded weakly, late, or not at all. Now the bomber began to wander. A slight roll became harder to stop. The nose wanted to drop. Correcting one motion created another. Keeping position in formation became impossible. Other bombers pulled away, each crew focused on its own survival. The damaged aircraft was suddenly alone. That isolation was dangerous. Lone bombers were easier targets for fighters and easier to finish off. They were also harder for escorts to protect. Inside, the crew had no time for panic. The pilot and co-pilot tested what still worked. Engines answered. That was critical. For Wright cyclone radial engines still produced power. Throttles still mattered. If control surfaces were unreliable, engine power could help steer by changing thrust from one side to the other. But engine steering alone was crude. Too much power difference could induce dangerous yaw. Too little would do nothing. The aircraft needed finer control. Crew members moved forward through wreckage and freezing wind to inspect the damage. What they found explained the strange handling. Control cables had been exposed and partly severed. Some no longer connected normally through the cockpit system. Others were hanging loose, but still attached farther aft. The bomber could still be flown, just not from the pilot seat alone. In that instant, the crew changed roles. Men trained for navigation, guns, or engineering became part of a human backup control system. Someone reached for the damaged cables. The idea was simple and desperate. If a cable still connected to a rudder or elevator surface, pulling it by hand might move that surface enough to help stabilize the aircraft. It would require strength, coordination, and constant communication with the cockpit. There was no guarantee it would work. The pilot called for small corrections. Left. Hold. Ease back. More right. Hands pulled bare steel cable against gloves and metal edges. The response was rough, delayed, and uneven. But the tail's surfaces moved. The bomber steadied. Not fully, not comfortably, but enough to keep flying. Now another problem appeared. Altitude. The aircraft had lost aerodynamic efficiency. Torn structure created drag like an open door in a storm. Cold air flooded the interior. Instruments were damaged or unreliable. Maintaining height with a wounded airframe demanded power, and power demanded fuel. They were still over enemy territory. To descend too early risked fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and terrain. To stay high risked stall, structural failure, or losing control if exhausted crewmen could no longer pull the cables. Every minute mattered. The pilot could not simply relax his grip. The men on the cables could not stop. Their arms burned, hands numbed in the freezing stream of air. Voices had to cut through engine noise and wind. Then one engine began to fluctuate. A minor change in RPM on a healthy bomber might be manageable. On this aircraft, with improvised control and increased drag, even small power loss could become serious. Uneven thrust would pull the airplane offline. More corrections would be needed. More strain on the crew. More fuel burned. The nearest safe landing field was still far away. And ahead of them waited the hardest part of all, getting a shattered bomber down without normal controls. The crew had kept the bomber in the sky. Now they had to land it. That was often the most dangerous phase for a damaged heavy aircraft. In level flight, speed creates airflow over wings and tail surfaces that help stability. During landing, speed must be reduced carefully. Flaps may be needed. Power changes become frequent. Small control corrections become constant. This B-17 barely had normal control at all. The pilot first needed a runway long enough for a fast approach and enough open space to recover from drift. He could not count on making sharp turns in the pattern. He could not assume brakes alone would save them if touchdown happened late. So the crew aimed for the widest margin possible. As they crossed friendly territory, ground personnel could already see something extraordinary approaching. The aircraft did not look complete. Its front section was torn open. Jagged metal framed empty space where the glazed nose should have been. Yet all four engines still turned, and the bomber still held altitude. That sight alone told experienced observers something important. The men inside were still fighting for control. In the cockpit, the pilot kept instructions short. He had to conserve everyone's focus. More left. Hold. Ease back. Power on number 3. Steady. Those commands went not only to throttles and controls, but to the crewmen gripping exposed cables. They were no longer passengers in the landing. They were part of the aircraft itself. The B-17's elevator controlled pitch, the motion that raises or lowers the nose. Too much nose up at low speed could cause a stall. Too much nose down could create a hard arrival and structural collapse. Rudder controlled yaw, keeping the nose aligned with the runway. Without alignment, landing gear could fail under side loads. Normally these corrections came through smooth cockpit inputs. Now they came through human muscle. The pilot kept extra speed on final approach. This was risky, but necessary. Higher speed gave more airflow and reduced the chance of losing control authority. It also meant longer stopping distance after touchdown. Everything became a trade. Too slow, they might drop. Too fast, they might run out of runway. The bomber descended through lower cloud and haze. Wind near the ground is often less predictable than wind at altitude. Gusts can push a damaged aircraft sideways at the worst moment. The first gust hit from the right. The nose drifted. The pilot called instantly. More left rudder. Hands hauled cable. The response lagged, then came. The aircraft corrected just enough. Another gust followed. Again the crew answered. This was no smooth military demonstration. It was a negotiation between gravity, airflow, machinery, and exhausted men. As the runway expanded ahead, the pilot faced one more decision. Use flaps or leave them up. Flaps increase lift and allow slower landing speeds, but deploying them changes trim and drag. On a crippled aircraft, unexpected trim change could overwhelm what little pitch control remained. He chose caution. The approach stayed faster and flatter than standard procedure. The runway threshold passed beneath them. Now came the flare, the subtle raising of the nose before touchdown. It is one of the most precise moments in any landing. Too early and speed bleeds away. Too late and the aircraft strikes hard. With damaged controls, precision was almost impossible. The pilot called for slight back pressure. The crew on the cables pulled. The nose rose a little. Main wheels met the runway. The impact was heavy, but controlled. For a second the bomber bounced. Weight lifted, then settled again. Engines roared as the pilot balanced power to prevent a swerve. Rudder corrections came through shouted commands and straining arms. Stay with it. Hold center. Ease now. The tail lowered. Speed bled away. The aircraft rolled long down the runway, rattling and shaking, but it remained upright. When it finally slowed to a safe crawl, men on the ground ran toward a machine many assumed would never return. Only then did the crew fully understand what they had done. They had brought home a bomber missing its nose section, with compromised controls, after roughly 10 minutes of improvised flight using bare cables and coordinated muscle power. That survival was not luck alone. It was the result of how wartime crews were trained. Bomber crews learned systems, emergency drills, engine management, communication discipline, and cross-role cooperation. In crisis, specialization mattered less than calm adaptation. A navigator might haul controls. An engineer might monitor power and damage. A gunner might relay signals or clear debris. The airplane survived because the crew functioned as one machine. The B-17 itself also earned its reputation in moments like this. Its rugged structure, redundant systems, and four-engine design gave crews chances that lighter or less durable aircraft might not provide. Damage tolerance did not mean invincibility, but it often created a narrow window for skill to matter. And skill mattered here. If the pilot had overcorrected, the bomber could have entered an unrecoverable roll. If engine power had been mishandled, you might have become uncontrollable. If the cable team had lost timing, the landing approach could have unraveled in seconds. If panic had replaced discipline, the story likely ends in enemy territory or short of the runway. Instead, it became one of the most remarkable examples of combat crew improvisation in the air war over Europe. Stories like this also explain something larger about strategic bombing campaigns. Behind every mission statistic were crews solving immediate problems no planner could predict. Weather changed. Defenses adapted. Machines failed. Survival often depended not on doctrine, but on decisions made in seconds. This crew made the right ones. When people remember the B-17, they often think of formations, engines, and gun turrets crossing the sky. But sometimes the real story is simpler. A broken airplane. Freezing wind through an open nose. A pilot asking for one more correction. And men pulling steel cables by hand until wheels touched home soil.